Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to our belated second to last lecture of the year. Before I turn things over to Professor Klug, just a couple of announcements. Obviously, there are the voting signs around. Make sure to vote tomorrow if you already haven't. I personally did it last week. Can't do it again, but if you haven't, please vote tomorrow. Also, just want to let you know about a couple of events that are coming up this week at the library. If you're really ready for spring to show up and you want something to like kind of push you towards being outside, this Thursday evening from 6 to 7:30 p.m. in the Volkansky room, just Volkansky A, so seating is going to be limited. There is a program called Bloom and Zoom, and it is about setting up a hummingbird garden in your backyard to attract hummingbirds. So that's Thursday from 6 to 7. On Saturday, if you're feeling a little more sporty and nostalgic for football to start, even though baseball just started, we have a great documentary coming to the library. It's called No Packers, No Life. It is about a businessman who was in Tokyo and unplanned ran into some Green Bay Packers super fans in the heart of Tokyo. And one in school, they brought them to the United States and to experience what a Packer game was like. And it's an incredible documentary. And the producer of the film, Ty Morse, is going to be here for a Q&A following the movie. He's also going to introduce it. So we've got your outdoor gardening, we've got your sport fix if you need one.
What time is the movie?
Oh, thank you. That is an excellent question. The movie starts at noon. The program runs from noon to 2, and that's with the Q&A. So, before I turn things over to Professor Klug and introduce him, I just wanted to acknowledge one final time for the year our sponsors, without whom we would not be here every week during this great 8-week period. So, even though I don't have my glasses, I do have them, but I'm just going to wing it. It's the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for our sponsors. As it turns out, I don't need to read it every week. I just know it by this point. Also, Darlene Wellner, who is sitting right here, wanted to say a few words before we get to the meat of the evening. So, Darlene.
Well, yeah, if any of you are in a state of shock, this is Tim Kaczynski. He looks a little different than usual. It shows how important this particular presentation is. So, anyway, and then you really can step up to the plate. No, seriously, I don't know where we'd be if it wasn't for Tim, because he does so much for this program in terms of promoting it in the community and promoting it here and all the mechanics, et cetera, contacting the speakers. Now, the other people do a lot of that too. I mean, and we're promoting it in the League of Women Voters and Unitarians and the library, et cetera, but it's, Tim is an integral part, and hopefully he will continue to do this for years to come. And we will have this again next year, because I think this is an extremely popular program and does a lot to educate people and get away from some of the parochial thinking that exists, you know. So thank you, Tim, very much.
What are you doing? He already has a mic. Thank you so much. I mean, it's an honor to do it. I don't think of it as anything but a pleasure and an honor. So I tried to discourage Darlene from even saying anything, but as usual, my old pal Darlene, as she refers to herself whenever she calls and leaves a message, wasn't about to listen to me. So thank you so much, though. Let's get to the heart of the evening, and let me introduce Professor Klug. Heinz Klug is the John and Rilla Bossert Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. He is a member of the California Bar, inactive, and is admitted as an advocate in South Africa. Growing up in Durban, South Africa, he participated in the anti-apartheid struggle, spent 11 years in exile, and returned to South Africa in 1990 as a member of the ANC Land Commission and a researcher for Zola Skate. Skawia. Thank you. Zola Skawia, chairperson of the ANC Constitutional Committee. He was also a team member of the World Bank mission to South Africa on land reform and rural restructuring. He has taught at UW Law School since September 1996. Professor Klug taught law at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg from 1991 through 1996. He also worked as a legal advisor after 1994 with the South African Ministry of Water Affairs and Forestry, as well as the Ministry of Land Affairs on water law and land tenure issues. In 2013, Professor Klug was awarded a Doctor Honoris Causa from Hasselt University in Belgium. He spent the 2024-2025 academic year as a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Ghana School of Law in Accra, Ghana, in West Africa. Professor Klug has presented lectures and papers on the South African Constitution, constitutionalism, and constitution making in Africa, land and water law reform, among other topics, in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, Ethiopia, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, the Netherlands, at several U.S. law schools, and, most importantly, Manitowoc Public Library. His teaching areas include comparative constitutional law, constitution making, European Union law, human rights and humanitarian law, property, and natural resources law. Professor Klug has published a number of books and over 100 articles and book chapters. These include studies of South Africa's democratic transition, constitutionalism in Africa, international law, and on legal realism. His most recent book is a second edition of The Constitution of South Africa, a contextual analysis, published by Hart Bloomsbury in October 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Heinz Klug.
Thank you, as usual, too much. Thank you all for being here and for making me actually go back on this history and about the relationship between the United States and Africa, which I had to learn about too. So I've got 61 slides, so we can go pretty quickly through them, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So what we're going to do is a short introduction and then look at US-Africa relations, trade with Africa, national security and military relations, aid to Africa, and finally talk a little bit about what it would mean to manage our relationship with Africa going forward from 2025. First of all, just think about Africa in the sense of the size. Right? Here is the map of Africa with, there's this joke that we have, Africa is not a country. Right? Because so often this is what you get, as if it's a country. Well, it's a country, it's a continent that if we load all these other countries in, it's a large continent. Right? It has 55 different countries and a long history. Another way to think about Africa at this moment is also just to think about it in terms of the variation across the continent. Economic variation, so easily seen in the gross domestic product of countries. This is from 2024. And, apart from Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa, most of them do not have very high amounts. But when you add it all together, you do get a rather large economic activity. One of the difficulties of the whole story, of course, is there's very little connection between these African countries in terms of the infrastructure, because the colonial system would have the infrastructure always go from the interior out to the ports for extraction. And so the problem is we have no railway system that goes up through the center of Africa. And so one of the issues that have arisen all along is if you're going to create an African economy, you need the infrastructure that would make that possible. And it's a continuing problem to this day. Okay, well, what about the history of US relations with Africa? And of course, we have to understand that that history begins with the slave trade. That is the history. It's what brought the African American community to this country unwillingly. Last year, academic year, when I spent in Ghana, and in fact, we're going to be taking 15 UW students to Ghana now in May. And one of the things I'm already worried about is we're going to be taking these young people to these castles or these depots where the slaves were taken through. And it's really an extraordinary experience to go through those sites and learn what actually went on there, a number of people who died there and on the way. So that's a history that where one has to realize that that's where it begins. And if you think about the transatlantic slave trade in general, and of course it's not all just to the United States at all, and of course it goes until 1866. And slavery in Brazil was still active into the 1920s, although it was officially ended in 1866. So that is a long, long history with the Americas for Africa, but it's a history of the exportation of labor. If you think about it in terms of the loss of labor from Africa during that period, it's over centuries, it's quite extraordinary. Puck was a magazine that, it turns out, came out of Chicago originally, written in German originally, and then in English, but then published in New York. And these two covers of this magazine back in 1899 and 1901 is kind of interesting, because in the one case you have on the left-hand side was when the British were involved in the expansion and the wars in South Africa. And you have in this cover America egging them on and saying, we buy you. And then a few years later, of course, in 1901, the Americans are in the Philippines and finding themselves bogged down and are sympathetic to the British, who were bogged down at that time in the what was called the Anglo-Boer War, the South African Wars in South Africa. Teddy Roosevelt goes to Africa. And it's kind of interesting when one frames it in that way, because he went to East Africa. And think about it this way. On his journey from Mombasa to the interior, Roosevelt took the recently completed Ugandan Railroad, traveling over 27 railway viaducts constructed by the American Bridge Company over the Mau Escarpment. Later encountered the American mission stations at Machakotos, Kijaba, and on the Sobat River, and an American ostrich farmer living near Lake Hannington, named for Bishop James Hannington, who visited the lake in 1885, but now Lake Bogoria. So Americans were in Africa and engaging in Africa in many different ways from very early on. It's not a recent relationship. Another way to see that relationship is US engineers were, particularly mining engineers, brought skills to Southern Africa, but not just mining skills. They also had experience dealing with labor in the West and in terms of migrant labor. And in fact, it was American engineers who suggested the closed compound system that became the basis of the migrant labor system in South Africa. So this relationship is a long relationship in different ways. The relationship also has a flip side, which is very interesting. So on the one side here, you see FDR with Churchill. And that was a photo taken, I grabbed it off a book cover, but it was a photo taken when they met just off Newfoundland during the war and created something called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter was a very important document because it was a document that described the Allied war aims for the Second World War. what would the world look like afterwards? And FDR and the United States presented a version of the world which said that all peoples had a right to self-determination, which Churchill had to agree with at the time, but said it only applied to Europe and to Europeans. It shouldn't apply to the colonies. And FDR and the United States rejected that. Now, you could argue, in one way that, of course, that was because at that point the US was emerging as a dominant global power and wished to have access to all those markets that the colonies that Britain kept to itself. But on the other hand, it also set up a process of decolonization where 800 million people around the world gained their freedom. So it was a very important position that the US took at that moment. And here is the result of it in a way. This is Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of, the first at that time prime minister of the first independent country in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, which was Ghana. And he's meeting here, of course, with Kennedy. So the US becomes really important to the emergence of independent Africa from colonialism as well. During the Cold War, there's a different set of relationships. And if you look at this, what you see is that you've got those, on the African continent, the color blue were allies of the United States. It wasn't a pretty picture at the time because, of course, the allies included apartheid South Africa and Namibia, as well as Mobutu in Congo. So these were authoritarian regimes in Africa at the time that allied with the US. And of course, it was seen as part of the Cold War because they were against the Warsaw Pact, against the Soviet-aligned countries, which here you see Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia at the time, and in the northern part of the country, of the continent, a range of other countries that were Soviet-aligned. But notice that most of the countries, the grey countries, were non-aligned. And the idea that the attempt by Africa at that point to try and be non-aligned, but in the Cold War, different choices were made. But where are we today? We're in the situation called BRICS, which we've all heard of. It's not BRICS as an organization has got lots of contradictions. Here you have on the one side Lavrov, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's because Putin couldn't come to the meeting because at that point South Africa had to acknowledge, even if some of them were sympathetic, that if he arrived, they would have had to arrest him under the international. Putin didn't come, but Lavrov came. There's Modi from India. There's Ramaphosa in the center from South Africa, and Xi from China, and Brazil, Lula from Brazil. And that's a global alliance today that we're having to engage with. Right? What's interesting, of course, it's not an alliance that's very strong. India and China have their issues, and there's lots of issues within that alliance. But it is an attempt to create an alternative alliance to the NATO alliance, which is a little weak at the moment, given the attitudes. Well, what about those? Let's look at the particular topics that I wanted to discuss with you today. We start with trade. Well, Africa's top trading partners today, number one is China. The United States is number two, then India, Germany, and France. The Europeans as a whole are bigger than the US, but these are exports, right, to Africa. So this is money we're making in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa's total trades, exports, and imports, the top line is the European Union, which when you add them all up, they're still a lot higher. The red line that's climbing so dramatically is China. The blue line, which is unfortunately dropping off, is the United States. And at the bottom is Japan, which, if we look at it from another angle, the bottom picture from 2003 is the relationship of trade, the US versus China. There, China is just making, the US is still quite dominant. By 2023, every country on the continent is trading more with China than the United States. That's up 12.4% from 2024, 134 billion. What's extraordinary about it is, if you think about where Africa is going to be in 25 years' time, it's going to be one of the largest demographies in the world and largest potential economic power, not as a power, but as a resource. And for us to be walking away from that is very short-sighted. Well, there was an attempt, or there is an attempt, there's an ongoing relationship called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And there was a lot of potential with AGOA. This enabled African countries to export to the United States duty-free, right, to get into the United States, get their products into the United States. As you can see from that bottom line, textiles and apparel, metals and machinery, it's not grand amounts, but it was exports from Africa, helping African economies to develop. US exports to Africa over the last 10 years, gone up and down, but not competing really very much with China. What's interesting is the areas, right? Minerals and fuels, nuclear reactors and machinery, aircraft, vehicles, so different products that manufacturing from Africa to the United States, mainly natural resources, which is the darker red color, a little bit in terms of manufacturing, textiles is big, and agriculture is not so big at all. If you look at it under AGOA, there was a moment in 2005 and then again after about 2012 where we were really managing to push that up. And then it fades off, particularly down to 2015 and on there. What AGOA has done to a large degree is enabled countries like Lesotho to develop low-level textile manufacturing. This is a photo of a factory in Lesotho at the time. Lesotho is a little country surrounded by South Africa, in Southern Africa, very small country. And if you look at these textile and apparel imports under the AGOA program, they do increase, right, from 355 million in 2001 to 1.4 billion in 2019. So it definitely is enabling economic development in Africa. But the US doesn't just use it for economic relations. There's also a political side to this. So if you look at this list of countries, what's interesting about this particular chart is that on the one side, it shows you that when countries have lost access to AGOA and the reasons they've lost that access. Human rights violations, coup d'etats are the two main reasons, lack of political pluralism, where the US has used this as a leverage in terms of political development. And the years when these countries managed to get back into AGOA because the US has considered they've resolved some of those issues. So this isn't purely a trade matter, there's a political element to it as well. In South Africa, the export of motor vehicles has been quite important under AGOA to the United States. It dropped dramatically for a while, but then was picking up again. And then along came President Trump and tariffs. And what's amazing is if you look at the country that was hit hardest was Lesotho. 50% tariff. Why 50% tariff from Lesotho? We all scratched our heads at the time. It's like this made no sense. Little Lesotho, there's nothing there. It's a small little country. What? Why 50% tariff? Well, it's the way they measured. What they did was they looked at the relationship between the exports to the United States and the imports into that country. So what was that country buying from America? And that was the differential that they worked on. Well, the American idea with AGOA was to enable this country to develop. This country has nothing. They can't buy anything from America. They can't afford it. So of course it's an imbalance in trade. The whole point was to get them so that they were earning enough that they one Monday could buy something from the United States. But instead we imposed a 50% tariff. And the same is for a number of these countries. If you look here, the only countries that weren't impacted was Somalia, right, which of course is basically an ungovernable area. It's barely managing to get itself back together again. The president has a lot to say about Somalis. But for whatever reason, didn't put tariffs on Somalia. There's nothing to put it on. But if you look at the countries that were hit hardest, strangely enough, I mean, Libya, yes, that's also a country that's not very functional at the moment. But all these southern African countries that were, Botswana. It's extraordinary, as Botswana was probably the most loyal ally the US has had over 50 years. And they smack it with 38% tariff. Right? It came at a very, very bad time for Botswana, because Botswana did incredibly well since independence and used its wealth very well compared to other areas of corruption. Botswana did very, very well and used its wealth for education, health. There's a health post there was at least a health post within a kilometer of every person who lived in Botswana. Right? It's 2.5 million people. It's not a big country. We took students there in May 2024 to the country. I'd lived there in exile for 6 years. But what's interesting is Botswana did well because after independence, they discovered some of the richest diamond pipes in the world. Did incredibly well. But now they're in enormous trouble. Why? Because diamonds, the price of diamonds has just cratered, because artificial diamonds now being made in China and India are just as good. They're made, in fact, under the same heat and pressure as real diamonds. They are real diamonds. You can't tell the difference. And the price is 10% of the price of a real diamond. And we were in Botswana, and we were touring a Rapa diamond mine with these students. They were explaining to us, no, it's going to be fine. They were really in denial. It's going to be fine, because what we're going to be able to do is we'll give you a certificate with your real diamond saying this is a real diamond that came out of the earth. I was like, how many people are going to worry about this? Is a certificate will come with your diamond there, But it's very tough. And then we knocked them a 38% tariff. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So again, if you look at exports to the United States from some of these countries, 20% of Lesotho's exports are to the United States, and they got a 50% tariff on it. And so it goes down through the list. It's not exactly large amounts, but it hurts them a lot. Then the question was, what was going to happen to AGOA? And for a long time, it was suggested that AGOA would be taken away as well. And so now we have this funny contradiction. We have these tariffs imposed on the countries, and then, because pressure finally from business made some difference, President Trump renewed AGOA. So now we've got AGOA renewed and the tariffs at the same time. Nobody knows exactly what's going on, because AGOA is supposed to be tariff-free entrance in the United States, and yet he has these lists of tariffs on these countries. So confusion is the story of trade at the moment between the United States and Africa. Well, what about national security and military relations? Post-2001, the issue became concern about potential sources of terrorism out of Africa. And so the United States created AFRICOM, which is the part of the military that addresses Africa, part of the United States military. So that's the AFRICOM's badge. And most recent activity in Africa was air strikes against ISIS in Somalia on February 13th this year. Not that any of us heard about that. And that was in coordination with the government of Somalia, which again, given what we say about Somalis all the time, is a little strange, but it was in coordination with the government of Somalia. AFRICOM is based the same place that many other countries have bases is in Djibouti, very small little country between Ethiopia and Eritrea, sitting on the Red Sea. It's not quite the Strait of Hormuz, but it's a very, very tight little area as well in that part of the world, and that's where that base is. If one looks at it, 11 nations have military bases in Djibouti, right? So it's considered by everybody as an important point, and the US has got a base there. And this is a photo I found of AFRICOM deputy commander visiting the Kenyan Defense Force. And so constantly trying to maintain these relations with militaries across Africa. When I was in Ghana in spring 25, we were up in Mole, which is right in the north of the country, and we walked into this restaurant area next to this game park, overlooking the elephants. It was quite extraordinary. And I saw this bunch of young people sitting around. I said to my wife, US military. And sure enough, it was a whole team who were there working with Ghanaian Defense Force just to try and map the area and know what was going on, because it's right up next to Burkina Faso, Mali, and those areas which are having real difficulties. So the US is present militarily, and there's cooperation, but still not very big, fairly small. But what about aid to Africa? The story, of course, has been that Africa receives aid. And if you look at this map, what you see is aid received as a percentage of gross national income in African countries. You can see Central African countries, South Sudan, which the US was key to help create, right, to help divide Sudan. These countries are up to 50% of their income comes from aid. But across the Sahel up there, you see a number of countries where there's quite a bit of aid dependence. Many of those countries have ended up back under military rule of late and are not democracies anymore. That's the aid story as it was. And US aid is important in Africa. And this humanitarian aid, as these photos show, this is in Ghana, aid arriving. And if you look at USAID's funding in Africa, Somalia gets the most, then Ethiopia, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan. These are all areas where the US is putting in quite a bit of aid. Nigeria, of course, in the northern parts. That aid, I always like seeing the boxes, US aid from the American people. I don't say from the American government, I say from the American people, which is fair, it's our tax dollars, right, going into this aid. One of the questions is, what is this aid used for? Right? If we try and understand how this aid is used. Security assistance is that little gray thing right on the top. It's very little, right? So not much of that at all. Development, economic assistance is not much better. Where the impact has been, and it's been really important, is in health. Now, I can give you a cynical story and tell you about the fact that this was very important, particularly when the HIV/AIDS pandemic came, and the US was worried, US pharmaceutical companies were very worried that their patents were going to be broken, and so PEPFAR got set up to ensure that they will remain committed to patents as long as the US paid the US companies for those drugs, right? So it was a way to protect our interests as well as, but it provided aid. It provided really important aid when countries couldn't afford it, right? I mean, when it was $10,000 per year per patient, when those first antiretrovirals came out in 1996, there wasn't a chance that anybody in Africa could actually afford it, right? And it turned HIV/AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable disease. And if you look at USAID disbursements in 2023, you had health 38%, humanitarian assistance, which is food basically, 47%, and the other amounts are fairly small comparatively. What's really amazing is if you look at it in terms of global aid, right, the total US aid in millions for health initiatives to sub-Saharan Africa was the highest, 42.3 million, right, in millions. If you look at deaths prevented by US aid between 2001 and 2021, you can see the distribution across Africa compared to the rest of the world. Right? The US aid at the health level was absolutely essential. Interesting enough, even if you compare it to the rest of the world, Europe, etc., the United States provided 42% of health aid. And that's globally. So a very important initiative that the US was definitely engaged with. Again, this was a 2021 in Ethiopia. This is how aid mainly arrives, right? It's another cynical version of it, of course, is what do we do with our surplus food? We provide it as aid to the world, maintains the market. If you look at US foreign aid money, what it's used for, right? Again, between humanitarian assistance and health, you've got your largest amounts of aid there. Well, so question I have for you, what percentage of the US budget do you think gets spent on aid internationally?
10%?
Oh, you guys are good. 1-2%. Yeah, that's most people in the United States think it's like 19%. But you guys are educated. So, but what impact does it have? This is terms of lives saved. Millions of people across the globe. Been really, really significant. And unfortunately, very shortly after the new government was installed here last year in 2025, one of the first things that was done was the president signed an executive order ending USAID. And there's the sizes of the cuts to African countries. Really, really dramatic. So a study by researchers from the US, Spain, Brazil, and Mozambique estimates that 91 million deaths were prevented between 2001 and 2021 in low and middle income countries due to programs supported by USAID, largest funding agency for humanitarian and development aid worldwide. Recent US foreign aid cuts could reverse this progress and lead to more than 14 million additional deaths by 2030. That's what that study showed. Makes no sense whatsoever in terms of what the percentage that we were spending to get this kind of impact in the world. So that was what I just read to you. Includes, of course, 4.5 million children under the age of 5. So how do we manage our relationship with Africa going forward from today? And that's the question that I think is worth thinking about. So for years, one of the driving forces behind USAID was a critical role in what was called America's soft power, right? Whereby the country raises its global standing through attraction rather than aggression. And the man who coined that concept was the former dean and faculty member of the Kennedy School, Joseph Nye. Right? And he put out a book called Soft Power. He says it refers to the idea that a country can use elements such as its culture, for example, movies and music, and political values to attract other countries rather than coerce them through military force. Soft Power was published in 2004. He had done a previous book in 1990 called Bound to Lead. And that was, if you talk to people in USAID, etc., that's what they understood this program was about. It wasn't just purely being nice to other people. It was about actually positioning the United States in the world. So that was that question, how much? And when you look at it, this was a survey done asking Americans what they think is spent on foreign aid, right? And over 51% thought 15% was how much of the budget was being spent on foreign aid. And of course, it's nothing like that. Foreign aid is small, but it is a contentious part of the budget. What you see, of course, is that drop in the first administration, then it goes up in Biden, and we know what's happening now. But it's not just the actual granting of aid, it's also attitude and how people see it, right? So President Trump has denied reports from NPR, although it's been repeated since, where he disparaged African countries as shithole countries and questioned why the US would admit immigrants from them and other nations like Haiti. And what's interesting is when you travel in Africa, which I do a lot, these are the kinds of things you hear all the time. Everybody's aware of it. So why did he call us shithole countries? That's something that spreads so quick, right? And, when you get the African Union, the official body of Africa, publicly condemning these statements, it doesn't make it go away. And then there was an executive order on February 7th, which again the world's very aware of, that made a number of statements about what was supposedly happening in South Africa, including this genocide of white South Africans, which is just not true, shall take appropriate steps consistent with law to prioritize humanitarian relief, including admission and resettlement through the United States Refugee Admissions Program for Afrikaners in South Africa who are victims of unjust racial discrimination. Yeah. Quite an extraordinary comment. But that's what people are hearing, right? That's what people in Africa are hearing, is these statements. What was interesting, of course, the South Africans' response to this, the government's response was, well, they're not refugees. If they want to go, fine, they can come back anytime, because they're not actually refugees. And they do, they go up and down. But they are, I think, of the 7,000 refugees that we've reduced the number from 125,000 to 7,000 that we're prepared to take, and all the slots have been kept for these white South Africans. It's a little strange. There's another development that, in fact, the Washington Post today even has something about it. I believe there are now 28 countries in Africa who've signed MOUs with the administration. So instead of the old program before where we provided aid as soft power, as a way to, we're now doing deals. And the way the deals work is if you want this health aid, which you kind of need, your health systems are falling apart because we used to support them to the degree that we did, you will agree to sign an MOU, which the Washington Post's piece this morning is about the fact that these MOUs are being kept secret. They've not been revealed yet. They're promising they will be revealed in time. But what we are learning about them, of course, from the other side, that's revealing what they are. The MOUs which say, we will give you aid as long as you give our companies direct access to important minerals. And it's just as crass as that. Zimbabwe was engaged in this negotiation, and eventually they walked away because they said they couldn't sign away their sovereign wealth for this aid. Zambia is going through it at the moment and probably will sign because they've got copper, which they've decided they need, and instead of buying it on the global market, we want special access. And that kind of use of international aid is not exactly soft power. It's not how you build soft power over time. What was interesting is, I think under the Biden administration, they had a similar meeting with African leaders in Washington, and they were able to bring 49 African leaders to that meeting. This was the follow-up one in July 2025, and they had a handful, right? People just aren't going to respond. So what's our response? Well, we now have a travel ban list. There are numerous countries in Africa that there are 12 countries under full entry ban. There are 14 facing partial bans. And these bans mean that people from these countries cannot get a visa for the United States, period. Students cannot come here and study. How did we build relations with these countries? We had students come here and study and get to know Americans and have those relationships. And now we just say you can't come. And if for the countries where you can get a visa, they're now suggesting, because we're so concerned that people overstay, and in fact, the history at least is that most of our overstays are Europeans. But people who overstay visas, we're so concerned about that if you're from an African country that can still get a visa, so it's not many, you have to put down between 10 and 15,000 US dollars in an account, which you'll get back when you return. The only problem is, where do you get 10 to 15,000 US dollars if you're from these countries to put in the account while you travel in the United States or go and study? Right? It just means you can't. Right? So again, it's just extraordinarily short-sighted. That's the only way I can understand it. It's like, what are we doing? So the present Ghanaian president, John Mahama, spoke at Davos in January this year, and he's talking about something called the Accra Reset, Accra being the capital of Ghana. He had a meeting there, and he's talking about negotiating together, trying to get African countries to negotiate, to try in very interesting ways to rebuild the Nkrumah dream, which is to in fact create a more united Africa. You know, whether they will succeed in that is not clear. It's very difficult. But that is the response from Africa at the moment. And of course, most recently, he's brought and it was Mahama and Ghana who brought to the UN General Assembly a resolution which was passed, 135 countries voted for it, that said that the Atlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity. Of course, that's a way to set up, to raise issues of reparations. It's not clear if that will ever happen, but it is a statement, at least from Africa now. Only 3 countries voted against this resolution in the General Assembly: the United States, Israel, and Argentina. 53 countries, most of the European countries, abstained. They didn't vote for it, but the rest of the world voted for it. I mean, yeah, however we think about it, I think they try to frame it as a more extreme crime against humanity. And from my perspective, no, crime against humanity is a crime against humanity. Don't need to try and put it on hierarchies of different kinds of horrendous crimes. But it's still, these issues are alive, right? They don't go away. Okay, well, those are my slides, and I'm happy to take questions and discuss.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Klug. So, if anyone, I think you know the drill by this point. If anyone has a question, just get your hand up. Stacy will be working the north side of the room. I'll be on the south side of the room. So if anyone has a question or a comment that you would like to discuss with Professor Klug, hands up. Oh.
I apologize because I think I wrote this down wrong, but did you say that USD comes from the American people, not the government?
No, the way it gets presented, when you see those boxes in Africa, literally says on the side, from the American people.
Okay.
And as a way to express the kind of solidarity, which would make sense.
Does China have any type of China aid to Africa?
They are doing it in terms of loans to government now. And what's interesting about it is the Chinese relationship with Africa is nearly as complicated as the American relationship. Right? When I was in Botswana in the 1980s, they had a demonstration rice growing operation that they were trying to do as a development aid thing. And the local Botswana were not happy. Why? Because they were bringing their own workers from China to work it. They wouldn't engage anybody locally. So the relationship is not, the trade is there now because you get cheaper things from China. Right? They're giving loans, but they're also being just as imperial in other ways. So they present themselves as much more friendly. When I was in Accra in 24, 25, there was they built a whole fishing port. The Chinese have built a very modern fishing port on the same space where traditional fishing operation out of Accra operated. The traditional fishermen were still operating, and they weren't able to open the port because the port was going to be used for Chinese trawlers. And there was a standoff. Beautiful port, not being used except for these wooden boats that the locals were using to fish. And it was, so, yes, China is very engaged in Africa. In Ghana, we went to a speech one night by this organization. And they had this fellow from China come and talk. We were fascinated, so I went along. And he had to stand there literally and say, well, Belt and Road was our first big operation, and we know you are very critical of it. He's talking to the Ghanaians. We know you're very critical of it. I'm here to say that was Belt and Road 1. We're going to have a Belt and Road 2 now where we're really going to help develop. Because Belt and Road 1 looked like setting up the same infrastructural exploitation, export as anybody else, right? So it's not so easy there either.
So is China building railroads like the Silk Road in Africa?
Yes, they're trying to do that. They haven't, I mean, so there's a big competition at the moment. The US is supporting the building of a railroad in Angola that would go from Libido right up to the copper mines in Zambia. And the US is trying to put that in place. The Chinese, of course, built already back in the 70s, Tanzara Railroad that went from Zambia, the copper mines, all the way to Tanzania, to the ports there. That's been refurbished by the Chinese. So, yes, that competition's going on.
I'm looking at the question.
Wait for the microphone, Darlene. Fast as I can.
I'm just looking at the questions in the discussion here, and it's what the number one.
Darlene, please hold the microphone to your mouth.
What you think I know by now? What should the United States prioritize as its interests in Africa?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think from my perspective, building relations with African countries that are more on a par, treat African countries as other countries. I mean, the idea of soft power was not a bad idea in terms of that relationship. And at the moment, that's not what we're doing at all, right? We're withdrawing aid. Maybe aid is not always the best idea, but then bring investment, right? Treat it like something that's more normal. But why not open it up for African students to come to? I mean, what the most successful stuff that was happening before was bringing African students, training people, building those relations. That's what the US has done successfully over the years. We just cut all of that. I mean, I was mentioning to some of you earlier that when I was in Ghana in this last period, I was there when the new administration began here. And one of the first things that President Trump did was he cut US aid. The embassy in Accra, the very big compound that is the US embassy, and as a Fulbright scholar, I would have to go and meet there and talk to people. Go onto the embassy grounds, and there is this 2-story building, the length of the grounds, that was USAID, that provided for West Africa and Ghana. After the executive order, they literally closed the door to this 2-story building, length of the compound, and just put closed on the outside. They said to all the Ghanaians who worked there, bye, you're done. They said to the American families, the American diplomats, these are people who are professional diplomats, right? They State Department, they're not politico in any way. They said to them, this was March 4th or 5th, they said to them, if you're not back in the US by March 30th, we're canceling your return tickets. No longer will pay the rent on the properties we pay for here right now. You will not have a job, and your health care will stop. And it doesn't matter that you've paid for your children to be in school here for the year, etc. Out. I mean, it was just absurd. There was no reason. So, in terms of trying to rebuild those relations, how do we change that?
I'm confused about this whole problem in Nigeria where they're kidnapping these children, and Trump is painting it as if it's Islam against Christian, which I've heard it's not. But what is that about? And then also, where are these groups getting their arms? And did they get their arms as a result of us arming them after 9/11 as so-called terrorist prevention?
So what we're talking about is northern Nigeria, right, and the connection to the Sahel, right? That's that area. And Nigeria, the history goes back a bit further in terms of those kinds of groups, because it isn't, you're quite correct, it's not Islam versus Christianity, it's not radical Islam. There are groups there that will call themselves ISIS because that's a way to try and get some support, some guns and whatever from, but mainly these are bandits. These are people who are trying to survive